Welcome back to our Q&A session. So, Ras, you can turn on your camera. Thank you very much, Ras. That was indeed very interesting. We have a number of people who are posting their questions on Facebook, and they are also sending their questions to us on WhatsApp and other Messenger and on other forums. We would encourage you to please post your questions on Facebook so that all of are on the same page. Now there is lots of emphasis on being on the same page. So it would be great if we are literally on the same page. And that page is basically Facebook page, our Global Institute of Law page. So Ross, Shazza Kamil from Karachi is asking about Muslim apologia, that they say that all these rights have already been given in Islam, and then what are you talking about? So this Aurat March and all that stuff. But then when it comes to actual provision of those rights, we see that those rights are not available. So um, isn't this a flawed argument? That first point is that you just say, oh, Islam has already given these rights. What are you talking about?
Okay, thank you for the question. That's a very good question. So when I talk about these rights, I think first and foremost we need to understand that there are a lot of provisions within the Quran and the Sunnah that obviously God has sent down to us in order to allow us to instruct the way we live our lives and the way we regulate our conduct with others. And within those, obviously, there are going to be certain rights that we as individuals have towards each other, towards God. And those rights would then are then a way to protect our own dignity, the way to protect, for example, our property, our right to marry, our right to life, etc. So those rights essentially may not necessarily be in the form of a treaty or may not necessarily be in the form of a constitution, but like there are certain guarantees that we are given through religious texts that are to an extent inviolable. um, so I think the fact is that a lot of the rights that we see, in international treaties do sort of build up on the rights that have been understood from the Western liberal tradition, as I said, like John Locke, Thomas Hobbes. A lot of them have advocated for, the right to life, the right to property, basically, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, etc. Those are essentially the part of the Ten Commandments. So we also need to look at how these rights essentially have been informed, but to some extent, by religious instruction, either Islam, Christianity, or whichever religious instruction. And then, however, in today's society, because it's so complex and we live in a society that is pluralist in nature, i.e., there's a lot of difference everywhere, we need to realize that this just using the rights as instructed in the in the Quran, in the Sunnah, or in any sort of religious instruction are not sufficient to govern our everyday lives, because obviously law and governance has been expanded so much since when these texts were actually revealed to us. So I think that's where the need for a more complex, a more cohesive rights system has developed. And obviously, because we live in a world which is now predominantly using the democratic rule of law, where we have, separation of powers, we have the court system, we have constitutions, we need to understand that there are more. We need to understand that these rights are also worldly affairs, and that we need to then govern those worldly affairs through worldly means. And that would mean using law, using policy. And so I think, to sum up, I think, yes, those rights have sort of come through religious instruction, both in, like, say, Western tradition and in our own tradition. But over time, because society has progressed to that stage where you need to be able to enforce those, you need to be able to implement those, you need to be able to observe those, that needs to come from that implementation, that enforcement has to be through something worldly, and that something worldly would be political power, legal power. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Shaza, for asking this question, and thank you, Ras. That was very comprehensive answer. Maybe if I may summarize the questions which audience are asking us into three basic categories. So one is historical, another is functional, and the third is institutional. So maybe let's start with historical. I mean, the critique of human rights is that it's just like the slogan of uh, civilizing the world. Now it has taken over new clothes. That's human rights. So post Second World War. So before that, the Western powers, colonial powers were there to civilize the world, and now
Exactly.
they are there to humanize the world, right? So that critique is very much there. I mean, if we just take contemporary examples, when Afghanistan was invaded, and Laura Bush made this speech in where she says, "Oh, we are just dropping these bombs, B-52s, and all that to protect women's rights." Yeah,
Yeah.
irrespective that most the people who actually borne all the brunt of the war were actually women and children, right? But the
Exactly.
whole this whole naked use of force, if I may use that term, was presented in a human rights language. So again, the war in Iraq, we just knew that why it was for resources. There were also geopolitics and whatever, right? But the whole package was presented, or it was just packaged, this whole whole agenda into the language of democracy and human rights. So maybe I want to pick your brains on that. Would you like to comment on this?
So again, I feel like it just stems back to the post-colonial Marxist critique model, which basically, essentially, what that model does highlight is the fact that because we are now living in a world that is dominated by Western forces, be it through um, political in the international law in the international arena, or whether it be in, say, economics, the fact that Western companies are now essentially as big as entire countries, and that they dominate pretty much the global markets. I think the fact is that it's very convenient for them now to establish this narrative that, oh, we need to save humanity, while they very conveniently overlook the fact that a lot of the destruction, or a lot of the, say, underdevelopment that the rest of the world is seeing, particularly the global south, is a direct result of the West's past actions. So the West is in a way sort of trying to cover up its own tracks, in a way, to be like, okay, look, we've done this, uh, we're now here to fix things. But are they actually fixing things? I don't think they're fixing things. They might actually be making things worse, because we're not seeing the same form of colonialism that was once there. We're now seeing a form of imperialism that is quite um, subversive. It's quite covert, in the sense that, for example, we're speaking English right now. We are. I'm wearing clothes that were probably made by American brands. I am, you know, using a laptop that was made for an American brand. The sort of food that I eat is obviously informed by Western culture. If I go to McDonald's or something, so I feel like we need to understand that the sort of grip that they have over the rest of the world is not as material, or not as militaristic as it once was. So it's very easy for them to then sort of evade that responsibility. Now, if we look at, again, historically speaking, we need to also look at the fact that during these colonial missions, the West would send Christian missionaries to forcefully convert their colonial subjects to Christianity. Right now, they're now advocating for the fact that we should be able to choose whatever religion we want, and that there should be a complete church state bifurcation, because now that's the norm. when in reality they were also very orthodox Christian states. If we look at the history of the British monarchy, that was the entire conflict was whether the system should be Catholic, Protestant. Um, so I mean, again, this hypocrisy is quite jarring if we look at it from that perspective. And um, this new humanizing mission is, in a sense, very insensitive, because it doesn't actually take they're not necessarily taking accountability for their past actions, but they're saying that, oh, the global south is underdeveloped because of its own, its own fault, which is why now we need to intervene and we need to protect human rights, when the same sort of power dynamics, the same sort of demographics, the same culture, and economic forces are remnants of the colonial experience, and that is something that they fail to recognize, which is why those countries that are actually experiencing those things fail to recognize as well. And so I think it becomes an entirely circular argument. So I hope that clears things out.
This is quite an interesting, Ross. Before we go to the next question, I just want to maybe hear more from you. This whole notion of East and West. So where this notion that, oh, the laptop we are using or the clothes we are wearing or the food we are eating is Western, and so we are the West. So it's West versus West. Well, I'm a great lover of Apple, so I have a MacBook Air Pro and I have iPhone Max Pro, and I'm loving it. But let me remind you that Steve Jobs was a Syrian student, right? So this whole argument that, oh, and then you have talked about Christianity. So where Christ was born, was he as blunt and blue-eyed as we are shown into films, right?
Not at
A
all.
person who was born in Palestine,
Yeah.
just Christ would look more like you and me, more brown, and maybe having gray or black eyes rather than the way he has been kind of Europeanized. Anyway, I think we have to be very careful when we essentialize things. Of course, when we are students, we are studying, we just take whatever is there written, but we need to evaluate whatever is presented to us. So what, first of all, this whole Eastern and Western dichotomy, it is deeply problematic. Now, one way to actually go beyond these essentialism is to look into functionalism. So another way of looking into things is to look into the functions. So forget about the form, whether there should be gender equality or not, where there should be universality or cultural relativism or whatever, right? So these are interesting philosophical debates. Now, let's take these notions and to the ground and concretize them. And one way of doing is looking into the functions. So why we need human rights? What is the function of human rights, right? So the whole argument is that state is too powerful. It has, maybe the actual word that we may use for lack of any other expression is hegemony, as you rightly mentioned. It's not that West is always holding a gun to our hand. It's to our head. It's not that the state is always putting a gun to our head and say do this, that. Most of the compliance with state regulations or international regulations, it happens based on our own volition. We feel that it's in our interest that we should comply with the commandments or the laws of the state, and also the whole issue of global governance, right? So that's very interesting. So I just want to ask you, what what do you think are the functions of human rights, and why we just need it? Why this whole issues packaged in this human rights debate? Why there is so much focus on human rights? Why they have become so contentious?
Sir, again, I feel like human rights are a way, or like are now an accepted way of maintaining a check on the uncontrolled um, coercive power of, the sovereign, the government, whatever you want to call it. For example, um, the state can't take my life away unless it shows good reason that, hey, I've taken someone else's life. That's a good reason. They can take away my right of life. Similarly, if they need my property for some reason, and they may compensate me and they may take my property from me, the the essential reason I think is, like, a lot of these Western philosophers have said, is that society is created so that humans can live essentially humans can live their best lives, and that best life would be by experiencing certain freedoms, um, the freedom to walk around without getting killed, the freedom to education, the freedom to, to buy property. These are essentially ways in which humans would achieve their truest self, according to a lot of these philosophers. So I think if there were no human rights, there were no, say, checks on governmental power, it would be very easy for a state to turn into a completely totalitarian state. Something I don't think any of us would like, because we would then essentially be at the mercy of the state. We'd be essentially risking our lives for in exchange for freedom. So I think that is the primary reason for human rights, and we've globally come to accept that there is inherent dignity in being a human being and being a citizen of whichever country you are. And that dignity needs to be protected, and that protection can be given by the state in order to be able to live one's life at one's own volition rather than to be at the mercy of the state. Because again, like you said, the state is a very it's if you look at a state as like an objective, from an objective perspective, the state is an extremely powerful entity. um, so to be at the complete mercy of that state without having any sort of checks and balances on that power would be an extremely futile existence, and we would not be fulfilling any other objectives of our own, or be able to attain any sort of knowledge or life experiences without, you know, the fear of potentially being eliminated by the state. So I think at the core of it, at the very core of it, human rights exist to assert the fact that society at the end of the day was created for the betterment of the individual, rather than to continue to live in a state of nature, like Thomas Hobbes said, that would be nasty, brutish, and short, whereby there would be constant fear within people that they would be killed or that their property would be stolen, etc., etc. So I think at the core of it, that is why human rights exists.
This is great. Now this takes us to our third point. So we have discussed historical and then functional, and the third is institutional structure of human rights. So I think you have rightly pointed out that human rights are a direct response to the power of the state.
Yeah.
And here, if we may go back to the original question that was posed to you about a Muslim apologist view. So if Islam has already given you all the rights and you don't need any, but we know that there is this ongoing debate whether Islam requires a state or not. And, and during the last terms, that was a point that had actually occupied us. So we were
Yeah.
studying Islamic law and the modern state, this elective course, out of which your presentation has risen, and a number of excellent pieces that you wrote, case notes, and then your final piece also. So now we just move on to the institutional structure of human rights. Now the argument is that why we have human rights, because state is so powerful that if its power is not curtailed through human rights, then it can actually decide who will live and who will die. And this is what actually state does, right? And if we can relate it to Pakistan jurisprudence, constitutional jurisprudence, remember this constitutional case, Doso case, it it had arisen as a criminal law case. A person was convicted, and the person comes to the court and says, "Hey, how can you just take away my right to life?" And the court says, "Well, actually, you don't have any rights." He says, "But I had right in the Constitution 1956, right? It had a full chapter on fundamental rights." And the court says, "But hang on a minute, that constitution has been abrogated by General Ayub Khan. So which means now you don't have any right. So look at the power and
Exactly.
authority of the state. So if there is no right written in the constitution and a dictator comes and you bring in Kelson, so basically you decide who will live and who will die. So such great power need to be curtailed and need to be limited. That's why we
Exactly.
have human rights. Now, my understanding is that if all the critics, whether it is Khalilur Rahman, Kamar, or other people, if they understand this important point, this important function of human rights, then they may lessen or may reduce to some extent their criticism of human rights. Because human rights are there to protect who? The weak and vulnerable. Against whom? The powerful and influential, be
Exactly.
it state institutions or individuals. So the whole purpose of human rights is basically to protect the weak and vulnerable, whoever they are, irrespective whether they are women, children, minorities, non-binary people, right? So or religious or ethnic minorities or whatever minorities they are there. So maybe, and one of the critique of Cairo Declaration of Islamic human rights is that although it lays down several fundamental rights, but unlike international human rights, it does not have any institutional structure to enforce those rights. So if we look into the menu of rights in Cairo Declaration of Islamic Human Rights, there are so many rights written. But who will enforce them? And then every right is subject to the principles of Sharia. But then who will tell us the principles of Sharia, right? So would it be at the mercy of hand-picked jurists, as it happening in Saudi Arabia, or by controlled religious institution just like Al-Azhar, which is under constant pressure by the government? So maybe tell us more about the institutional structure of human rights. So you have these rights. How will these rights be enforced or concretized, and how will they achieve the basic objective and the basic objective of being protecting weak and vulnerable in society?
So that's a great question, and I believe that as a student, I don't have the entire sort of understanding of the nitty-gritties of state governance and everything to provide like a very detailed plan or like a structure to how these institutions should be set up. But I do feel like the first step right now is to sort of diminish this narrative of human rights as a western poison, and we need to realize that at the end of the day they are for our betterment. That is why they're called human rights. um, Institutionally speaking, I feel like if you talk about Pakistan at least, there is a very clear uh, rule of the majority, and there is a very clear favorability that is given to members of that majority, Sunni male Muslims, right? And particularly from the upper classes. And that is precisely what democracy was not supposed to be. Democracy was envisioned, if we look at it from Greek and Roman, prehistoric Greece and Rome, it was envisioned to allow participation from people from all walks of life, and regardless of their wealth, their education backgrounds, their race, their religious affiliations. And true democracy only works when you have that participation from various walks of life. And if human rights again are part and parcel of that democratic liberal tradition. So, in that sense, I believe that first and foremost, there needs to be an investment in the sort of institutions that we set up, and that would entail, again, right at the top, that would entail the legislature. The legislature should have seats that are not necessarily representative of the population, particularly in Pakistan, where you have above 90% being Muslims, then just a few being Hindus, because again, that would essentially completely diminish any sort of motions that minority seat members might actually bring to the table. You need to be able to give various people that opportunity to bring forth their agenda to the table. Similarly, in the judiciary, again, you need to invest in greater judicial sensitivity training that prioritizes due process of law, the observance of correct evidentiary and procedural rules, and it, again, these institutions can only be invested in by the state. And if the state continues to dismiss these, and the state continues to dismiss human rights from the agenda, and rather favors other aspects of governance, then none of this can actually be achieved. So institutionally speaking, I think having a strong judiciary system is going to be very important, because it is the executive which may cause human rights violations, and it is therefore the responsibility of the judiciary to be able to step in and to correct those measures and to provide relief to those who have actually suffered. And similarly, I believe that policy making and even lawmaking needs to be invested in a great deal on the human rights front, because again, we are seeing a continued dismissal of human rights. I mean, every other day in the news you see the news of an abduction, forced conversion. You see, a murder of a child, and like you just hear these harrowing tales, and you just think to yourself, like, what is the state actually doing? Why is the state continuing to let these happen? Like, what are we missing? And what we're missing is the fact that we believe that these instances will eventually end on their own, that like we will, as a collective society, we will just come to terms with the fact that this is wrong, and like will, on our own volition, will stop doing these things. But actually this needs to come from a top down approach. This needs to come from the state. We need to see the state investing in its police forces. We need to see the state investing in the judiciary. We need better judicial sensitivity training. We need better policy making. And again, as a student, it's very easy for me to just say these things, but obviously the fact is that there are very clear barriers to this happening, particularly in the constitution, the way the legislature is set up, in the sort of religious affiliation that belongs to certain members of the parliament, and your president and your prime minister can only be Muslim, and that is very problematic in itself, because if the state of Pakistan was created not just for Muslims but for people of all religious beliefs, as stated in the very famous speech made by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, if we're going to see the complete opposite of that being if it being manifested today, then I think it raises a clear red flag that we are going in the wrong direction. And as much as easy as it is for us to have this discourse on Zoom, on Facebook, we need to be able to take this to people in the government, who are actually tasked with the responsibility of not only observing their own human rights obligations through treaties, but also to their own people, because that is essentially why they are in power. And so, yeah, I think institutionally speaking, the judiciary is very important. And in terms of the legislature, we need to be able to give space to people from all walks of life rather than to, again, perpetuate a skewed rhetoric of governance in law that we are currently seeing today.
Excellent, Ras. Audience is enthralled, including myself, by your eloquent answers. I think
Thank you so much.
this is fascinating. Um, I propose that we should take another 10 minutes break, and then in the next session we'll talk more about your journey as a student and now as a budding scholar. So let's give our audience 10 minutes break. We don't run any advertisements, so this is not an ad break. So because we are not for profit organization, um, so we are not sponsored by any Coca-Cola or Pepsi, right? You know what happened to Coca-Cola at the hands of
Yeah.
Cristiano Ronaldo.
Yes.
So we won't be advertising anyone, but we'll just be asking our audience to just think about it, whatever we have been discussing, and then in the third episode of our session we'll talk more about Ras, about his personal journey, and we may have some tips for students who want to succeed in their career or as in their studies. So Ras, please stay tuned with us, and
Sure.
Legal Eagles, please stay tuned with us, and we'll be back in 10 minutes.
Great.